Just didn't want to slam the door in your face. Okay. Is my microphone on? It is not. There it goes. All right. So, hello again and welcome back. Okay. So, hopefully you are here for SOC 3. I lost my mouse. Where it is. Hopefully you are here for SOC 377, right? Which we're Sociology of Youth. Okay, so we're going to continue on talking about what we were talking about at the end of last class, right? So we went through, in the first part of the class, we were talking about sort of where our kind of notions of youth and childhood come from, right? So we traced this kind of history from the development of the printing press forward. And we started talking about sort of our living generations and what they were like as young people, basically how their lives were shaped. So we're going to keep doing that today. Before I get started though, so I went too far. My brain, I'm sorry. My brain is not braining at the moment. Okay, so before I go too far, any questions about the course, about exams, about anything that you are wondering about, worrying about, thinking about, need to ask a question about before I get into new content? Okay, no problem. All right, so where were we at the end of last class? We were talking about the silent generation, right? So this generation born between 1925 and 1945. So just to kind of review, I guess I'll review a couple quick things. I'll probably do this more on Mondays because between Wednesday and Monday, there's a really long gap and sometimes we forget what's going on. We're talking about kind of the account of these different generations and especially what they were like as young people that comes from Jean Twenge's book. I just remembered that this is the room with the worst desks on campus. As I saw you walk in, I'm like, oh, why did you choose the one with the little desk? But I guess that one's too close. Oh, I hate this room. I can't wait until they redo the whole thing. Sorry, I got distracted. We were talking about this book, Generations. Forgive me, I just got a repair bill for my car for like $5,000. I'm deeply traumatized. Would you all like to contribute $50? No, I'm kidding. Of course, don't give me money. It might be time for ye old Dodge Grand Caravan to hit ye old scrap pile. But that is my problem and not yours. So we're talking about Jean Twenge's book, Generations, right? And we're going to go through these generations kind of from the silence all the way to Gen Z and just talk about what these generations are like, what some of their defining characteristics are, and how that has kind of shaped them going forward, but also the kind of generations that come after them, right? So, as I said last time, and again, just to review, she is an advocate of what she calls a technology model of generations, which fits nicely with that account from Neil Postman in some ways. But basically this idea that, each generational cohort is defined by the technological conditions experienced in their kind of early years, in their formative years. Okay, so we also talked about kind of our one of these basic ideas that she has, which she calls life history theory. Essentially the idea that, when you are deciding to have and raise children, you essentially have sort of two options. Either you have lots of them and they grow up quickly because, your risk of death and their risk of death is relatively high. So each child gets very few resources, or you have few of them and you invest a ton of resources into them. And this is kind of more where we are today. Okay, so Talked a little bit about the silence last time. We just got kind of started on them. This generation, again, 1925 to 1945. The generation between the greatest generation and the boomers, and the one that kicks off, most of the really big epochal cultural changes that we often associate. Ooh, a fruit fly attacked me. With later generations. If you don't know me, you'll get used to how strangely random I am. I'm sorry. I often, when I'm in professor mode, I just voice everything that comes into my head. There's no filter anymore, so the fruit fly attacking me just comes out. Okay, so things like civil rights, feminism, gay rights, all of which are kind of epochal changes, huge social landscape changes, all really start with this generation when they are in their 20s and early 30s. All right, so this is where we ended last time. We were talking about the silence and technology. So what was kind of new and happening in the world of technology when the silents were young? And sorry, I'll tell you why I chuckled. I used to teach this class a few years ago, and I had essays, and people would write about the silent generation and the baby boomers, and they would say, these generations grew up without technology. And I always found that, I don't know why people wrote that. I think they meant the internet, but it was always funny because I would tell my dad that, and my dad's like, yes, we lived in caves with, sticks and wheels made out of rocks. No, wait, that's a technology. So I chuckled a little bit when I think of that, right? What are the technologies the silents grew up with? I know it seems primitive from our vantage point in some ways, but okay, they grew up and they were kind of coming of age. I guess they're in their teens and early kind of adulthood when television is coming onto the scene, right, and becoming a major kind of player in the American and global media market, and things like jet and space travel, right? I guess space travel, we're starting to launch people into orbit and starting to put satellites into orbit, which allows us to create, electronic communications networks that kind of go around the world really, really quickly, much more quickly than, say, the transatlantic cable systems and undersea cable systems that had been set up previously. Okay, so we pick up here. The other thing that's happening, and we'll talk a little bit more about we'll talk a lot more about this as we go through the course, because this kind of point and this topic comes up over and over again. We talk about the changes that have happened really since the middle part of the 20th century to the present, right? Essentially this 70-year period or 75-year period. I guess it's 80 years from the end of the Second World War now, because they're celebrating victory in Europe tomorrow and Friday, depending on where you are. So yeah, it's in this 80-year period. So one of the things that really changes, and this is a change that's going to take place really gradually, but pick up steam as we move, further and further from the 1950s towards the present, is that we have a gradual shift in Western economies away from economies that are dominated by manual labor and into more of what you would call a service-based economy, right? Now, one of the things that this does is it opens a lot of opportunities for women to enter the workplace, because the manual labor type jobs tend to prize strength, like physical strength. Not saying women aren't strong, it's just on average men are stronger, and so those jobs tend to be dominated by men. As the service economy grows, there's more and more positions that don't prize strength, and for which therefore women have either as good a chance or as good an aptitude, or often a better aptitude for those types of jobs than their male counterparts, right? And we'll see when we talk about education and work that this is, this trend, which starts with the silence, has really played out to the present, to the point where women in lots of ways are outperforming men educationally and increasingly economically. But again, we'll talk about that as we go forward. The trend just kind of starts here, and it's going to develop as we move forward through the generations and through time. Okay. And the silents in lots of ways are probably the last generation for whom, on balance, social rules were more important, social rules and duties, right? Rather, social rules and duties were more important to them than individual rights. Now, that's not to say they don't care about individual rights. The shift starts with the silents in a lot of ways, but many of them are still very much concerned with social rules and duties. And this has a lot of kind of long-term effects on how they live their lives. All right. Just to kind of illustrate this, right, in the 60s, black and white people were segregated in the US South, and women were actively discriminated against in, various professions. And by the 70s, all of this has started to change, right? Now, by the 70s, most of your silent generation are into their 30s, and some trending into their 40s. But a lot has changed from when they entered the scene as the kind of youngest generation. And our later born silents, right, so those born closer to the middle part of the 1940s, were the first to experience more than a third of their mothers, right? A third of their mothers, so 1 in 3. I know you know what a third is. Working when they were school age. So even, we tend to think of working moms when children are in school being a relatively recent thing, probably dating more from the 1980s. And that's when it becomes more of a majoritarian or a majority kind of activity. But even by, we're talking about here the 1950s and 1960s, about 1 in 3 mothers, right? So the mothers of the silent, so probably greatest generation people, were also working while their children were in school. So economic opportunity for women really starts to increase in this generational cohort. Okay, so the silents are really weird in one way, and particularly when it comes to marriage and children. And this, has really long-term consequences, even for us, even to today. So one of the things that had been happening, right, for a long time, right, really since the beginning of the 19th century, right, so right around 1800, really, I guess, coinciding with things like the Industrial Revolution and urbanization, is that you'd had a couple of kind of things happening. Age at first marriage for both men and women had increased substantially, right? So by the time you kind of start the 20th century, age at first marriage for men and women are sort of at all-time highs, right? Men on average getting married at around 26, and women getting married on average at around 22. And this kind of, it ticks down a little bit, prior to the arrival of the silent generation. And then you can see that as the silents enter adulthood, right, the first silents turn 18 here, the age at first marriage drops, by a couple of years, right? It's not like crazy. It goes from a little over 24, like 24 and a quarter, down to, 20, just under 23 years old, right? And it kind of stays there, through most of the silent generation for men. And the same thing for women. Women had been getting married older, right? They were on average about 22 at the turn of the 20th century. Just before, right by the kind of beginning part of the Second World War, it is, 21 and a half, and it drops down much closer to 20 years old down here. And this is really kind of a reversal of this long-term trend. Like through the 19th century, we'd seen age at first marriage rising for both men and women. People were getting married later and later, and it declines for the silents. And then, as you can see, once the silents sort of enter or sort of exit a little bit, the number goes back up pretty substantially. So it's a weird kind of cultural moment where lots of people are getting married. Okay, the age of first marriage for women in the silents declines compared to those previous generations, reaching its all-time low of 20.1 years old in 1956. And I love this one. Half of new brides, so half of the women getting married in the 1950s were teenagers, right? Now, most of these are between 17 and 19. There are the occasional ones that are still getting married prior to that, but it's relatively rare, right? So these are mostly women who have graduated from high school or would have graduated from high school if they had completed school, but about half of women are in this demographic. So if you can imagine, right, that would mean most of the women in this room would already be married, or at least half of you would already be married, by the time you start university, which is obviously a little bit hard to imagine from today's standards. Most of them meet their husbands in college or in high school, right? A lot of people marrying their high school sweethearts in this generational cohort, right? And they get married right after graduation. And here, again, when I talked about they're really kind of in tune to social rules and duties, why do they get married? Well, they kind of get married because everyone else is doing it, right? It's the sort of social norm, and it's a sort of social script that people follow and are following. And it's not that different from what we see today, just that today we have a different social script, right? And we'll talk about the social script around marriage when we get to the unit on families, because the social script on marriage for millennials and Gen Z is quite different from what we see with, all of our prior generations, but the silents and the boomers in particular. So what does this script look like, right? There's social scripts around a whole bunch of things in human life, right? You kind of know what to do because other people are doing it. I swear they target me. They hunt for me. They find the class I had in SAB building. There was a truck that would just back up and go forward all class, all semester. It was just like beep, beep, beep. And so now they're vacuuming. At least it means they're renovating these rooms, and hopefully the desks of doom are on the way out. Okay, so what does the social script look like? Okay, so it's something like the following, right? Basically, somewhere in your kind of late adolescence, right? Somewhere between kind of 16 and 19, mostly while you are in high school or, in college, you will, meet your spouse. You will date them, right? Or they'll court you for a little while, which may involve them kind of meeting your parents, sitting in your family residence and chatting with your parents, maybe then going out on dates, right, to movies or to, the stereotypical soda shop, right, or whatever it happens to be. And then you would sort of, once you're reasonably attached, you would say that you're going steady. And then from there, usually engagement and marriage are the next logical steps. And you would do this very much, so that by the time you graduate, you are moving into marriage. And you could call this, and we'll talk about this later, the silents have what you would call a foundational model of marriage, right? Where, if you're going to build the house of your life, you start with the foundation, and the foundation is marriage. And we'll talk about this, like I said, when we talk about families, because, by the time we get to millennials and Gen Z, they have a totally different view of marriage and how you build a life. We'll talk about that later, and where marriage kind of sits. Okay. The silents have a lot of kids. Like a lot of kids. Okay. Again, Fertility rates in the West had been trending downward roughly since, the Industrial Revolution. As people moved off of, family farms and into cities, children went from being kind of an economic bonus, right? Free workers once they got big enough to do stuff, to an economic kind of negative, right? And I was going to call children an economic burden, but I don't want to use that language, but kind of. Okay. So children went from kind of an economic plus to an economic minus, let's say. They, instead of generating revenue for you or generating resources, they actually take resources away. So we had seen fertility rates dropping pretty steadily in the West, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, even, prior to having things like hormonal artificial birth control. And the silents are basically, they're a pretty major reversal of that, right? So by the time we enter the 20th century, right, even without hormonal birth control, we have a total fertility rate of roughly 2.5 children per woman, right? So do you all know have you all taken enough demographics to know what total fertility is? Some? Others no? Okay, I'll explain. So total fertility, right, or TFR, is basically a measure of the total fertility of the female population of your society. Or it's roughly the expected number of children you're going to have per woman during their sort of reproductive years, right? And generally speaking, we think their reproductive years are from about 15 to about 44. So replacement level fertility, right, what you need in order to kind of just replace your population is about 2.1, I know I talked about this last time, children per woman, right, over their lifetime. So it had been, prior to industrialization, the total fertility rate was relatively high. So maybe I'll explain this number. This really only applies to industrialized societies. Replacement fertility for pre-industrial societies is considerably higher because more people die of, there's more infant mortality. In industrial society, it's 2.1 because you basically have to, replace the parents and account for a small amount of infant mortality. And the fact that, technically speaking, slightly more boys are born on average than girls, right? Genetically speaking, humans produce slightly more male offspring than female offspring. It's like 51 to 49 if you take the average there. So you need just a little bit more than 2 children per woman to keep populations from declining. So prior to, the silence, basically total fertility was bumping somewhere around, 2.2, 2.3, between 2.2 and 2.3, and kind of at the height, 2.8. It goes up and down. And obviously when people don't have reliable birth control, there's less ability to sort of control and target that. And then everything sort of goes weird when the silents enter their peak fertility years, right? And this is, by all accounts, a historical aberration, right? We've never really seen anything like this in an industrialized society before or since, these kind of massive fertility spikes. Typically what happens is fertility declines, and then once you introduce like birth control, it declines even more. But the silents kind of buck that trend for lots of reasons, right? So the most common family type that they had grown up in, right? So what the families that the silents had grown up in when they were kids, their families were probably like a lot of families today, 2-child families, right? That was the most common family form. The total fertility rate prior to the Great Depression, and obviously people try to have fewer kids during an economic depression, right? That's right here, was 2.5 children per woman. For the silence, it peaks at around 3.8 children per woman in 1958, right? And it doesn't go back to its its pre-silent generation kind of spike until 1968, right? So it takes a really long time. And even the advent of birth control, right? Birth control first gets approved in the American market in 1959 and then becomes widely available in 1962. Even with, the availability of hormonal birth control, you still see, fertility stay relatively high for 6 years after the pill becomes widely available. Okay, I want to put this number in context a little bit, right? This 3.8 children per woman. Because this period, right, it's going to become very important because our next generation is named after it. This is a period known as the baby boom. This kind of post-World War II period where you have just an absolute explosion in fertility and a huge number of people born. So in the US, I think I have this on a forthcoming slide. Yes. In the US, let me go back. This amounts to roughly in this period, right, between 1945 and 1962, 76 million babies being born. Right? So this is like nearly double today's population of Canada in, roughly a 15-year window. It's more than it's substantially more than the population of modern day France. I think it's half the population of the Russian Federation, right? So this is an enormous number of people born in a very, very short period. Now in Canada, it's about 8 million. We have about 8 million babies born in the same period for a population of only somewhere around 12 to 13 million people, right? So it's an absolutely massive demographic explosion. And it's going to have ramifications for ever. Like literally, we're still, like I said last time, the fact that Mark Carney won as prime minister is still basic, whatever you think about that, is still basically a function of this, right? Because the people who voted for Mark Carney overwhelmingly were the people born in this demographic. So we're still feeling the ramifications of this. The silence decision to have 3.8 children per woman still affects you and me today. So if you're like, I can't find housing because the boomers keep holding on to all of the housing, you can be like, damn silent generation, why did you have so many babies and make them this overwhelmingly powerful demographic for decades to come, right? Good times. All right. Now, for the women of this period, right, they both had, a lot of children. They were increasingly involved in the economy, but in terms of cultural norms, they were still expected to do the bulk of domestic tasks, whether they worked or not, right? So the cooking, the cleaning, the care of children, the laundry, all of that stuff was still overwhelmingly done by women in this period, which is why they also are the ones, I think, that get really disaffected, and advocate for changes in gender norms. Okay. Actually, I'll just leave that. Okay. So here we go a little bit beyond what they were like as young people, but it does connect, I think. The silence through their whole lives have been remarkably resilient to depression and anxiety. For whatever reason, right? They are, we'll see, as we get later on in the course, that the rates of anxiety, especially for Gen Z and younger millennials, have really spiked. But if we look here, right, this is kind of rates of anxiety, and these are our silence. And this is the rest of the population, right, 1946 and later. And what you see is, big spike kind of very early in terms of percentages. It goes up really quickly as soon as we start getting other demographics. And we see, much higher average kind of rates of anxiety and depression amongst generations other than the silents. So the theory that Twenge sort of advocates for is that the silents are more socially connected than other generations, right? Particularly, they had large families that were more intimately connected. So they were, less prone to isolation, depression, and self-harm, including, suicidality and attempting suicide, than other generations. So they had lots of kids, right? Their kids were, kept in touch with them, and because they had lots of them, there were lots of children that they could stay socially connected with, even as they moved through life. And I remember, my wife's grandmother, right, when she was kind of in her later years. She's passed now, I guess passed about 10 years ago. But through the last 15 years of her life, right, she lived in a nursing home, but she saw, 4 of her 6 children like at least once a week. They all visited her or called her or took her to appointments and all of these sort of things, including my mother-in-law, right, who would drive her to all sorts of medical appointments she has as she was getting older and sicker. And this is the kind of thing that Twenge is suggesting. These large families provided a sort of built-in network of children and then grandchildren that the silents stayed really well connected with. Okay. That took me 34 minutes to get through one generation. So the boomers. Trying to think, I'm trying to count really quickly. If I think of my wife's grandmother, how many grandchildren she had? So she had 6 children. How many grandchildren? I do the math quickly. 2, 4, 8. Oh, I'm gonna say 15 grandchildren, right? So 6 children, 15 grandchildren, roughly. I'm trying to remember my wife's family, and I won't tell her because she's going to get mad at me that I can't remember all her cousins, even though we've been married for 20 years. So 15 grandchildren, right? 6 children. All of these people were in touch with her in her kind of older years, right? This is going to be obviously quite different when we get to the baby boomers, who had far fewer children, and then whose children also had fewer children. Okay, so the boomers, right? And again, this is these guys, right? This is the baby boomers right here. So they are not the ones who had all the kids. They are the kids who were had by primarily the silent generation. So keep that in mind. For some reason, sometimes people get that mixed up, that the boomers had lots of kids. Actually, the boomers had way fewer children, and that ends up being a big demographic problem in and of itself. All right. So the baby boom, which we just talked about, starts as, basically soldiers are demobilized from, the various Western militaries, the US and Canada primarily, but we see similar things in the UK and France as well. As these soldiers returned home from the war, in 1945 and 1946. So we start to see these babies being born in 1946 and 1947, right? So, and the baby boom is a very long, sustained demographic bulge. So if you ever listen to demographers, they'll talk about, something like this as a demographic bulge, right? Because it is kind of a, in otherwise kind of steady, bumpy lines, it's a big kind of spike. So you could also call it a demographic spike. And yeah, like I said before, by the time it had ended in the United States, you had 76 million babies born, more than the current populations of France. It's like 1.5 times the population of Canada. So if you can imagine, within a 15-year period, everybody in Canada plus, half more being born, that would be what you're looking at. So absolutely massive in terms of a demographic kind of surge. Why are people texting me? Okay, I don't know. Not important. It's not my children being like, my leg is severed, please come pick me up at school. Okay, so like I said, this is a reversal of a more than 200-year decline in birth rates. And it doesn't last, right? Because after the boomers are done, it ticks back down. It drops below replacement fertility. In the US, it'll tick above replacement fertility for a bit and then tank again in the 2010s. Canada's a little bit of a different story. But, I'm sorry, I'm going back and forth because I needed that chart. All right. So, this led to the boomers dominating the landscape at every stage of their life. So, what I have here, right, if you look at this is what's generally referred to as a demographic pyramid, right? In that a normal population distribution typically is kind of pyramid-y shaped, right? Where you have very few old people at the top and a lot of young people at the bottom, right? Because old people die off, they get sick, they die, and they're replaced by young people. So at least if you have, replacement fertility or slightly above, it should look kind of like this. And this is what, the population kind of pyramid looked like as the boomers were entering into late childhood, adolescence, and emerging adulthood, right? And you see them, right? They're here. This is the boomers right here. And what you can see is as they've moved through life, they're the fat part all the time. Right, they're that big fat part here. Here, this is the millennials kind of here. So millennials are also a fairly big generational cohort. So what does this mean? Okay, this is a really good demographic kind of structure, right? A lot of young people, especially a lot of young workers and people who will soon be workers, who can do things like, oh, hang on, let me back up one sec. One of the things that happens, the silence and the greatest generation, for themselves, they pass a whole bunch of, economic entitlements. Things like, in Canada, it's the CPP and OAS, Old Age Security. In the US, right, it's Social Security and Medicare. So these are, essentially, well, like I said, they're economic entitlements, right? Things that you get once you're at a certain point in your life as a sort of result of having, done your time. Now, these structures work really well if there's more people up here, less people up here than there are down here. Because essentially, the people down here are paying for the people up there, right? Things like the Canada Pension Plan and Social Security in the US are always kind of like a Ponzi scheme, right? It's the new people coming into the market. By the way, that's y'all. As soon as you graduate from here and get jobs, you get to pay for like my parents. No, just my parents. I'm not that old yet. I got a ways to go before I get old age security. So, the people down here, through your taxes, pay for, the people up there, which works really well when you have this pyramid-shaped demographic pyramid. So for the baby boomers, and the silence in the baby boomers, this was not really a problem, right? Because they had these very normal distributions. The boomers kind of make this a bit of a problem, right? Because they're this big fat part of the curve. And it's okay, here in 1995, because they're still paying and there's still more of them than there are people here by a fair margin, right? However, once we get to 2020, and this is the American one, what you see is that these parts of the curve where people are starting to retire and collect benefits are almost as big as the lower parts of the curve. So today in Canada, it's something like for every one retiree, there's about 2 workers. Back here, for every one retiree, there was something like 7 to 9. So the fact that the boomers have remained such a big demographic is going to generate a lot of problems. They've dominated the whole political and social landscape at every stage of their life because they're such a large and, shall we say, politically active demographic. And they're going to continue to do so probably until there's not enough of them to outvote the other demographics. So I got a little lost in my macroeconomics lecture. This is the kind of structure that we have today, right? With the boomers increasingly moving into, their 70s and their, well, I guess, yeah, their 80s. Their 80s are going to be coming up pretty quick here. The first of the boomers are going to be moving into their 80s this year. So this is going to cause a lot of social strain. And like I said, one of the things that that's pretty obvious is that the boomers have always voted for what's good for the boomers. So, in this past election, though it wasn't really on the ticket, one of the things that's obvious is that the boomers voted for, maintaining things like old age security at the current levels that they have it, rather than, what was perceived by them that the conservatives would maybe cut back old age security. So they're still voting for their own interests, and because they're so big, they're a really, really powerful demographic, and they have been through their whole lives. Okay. So, their values. What are the boomers like, or what were they like as young people? So, they internalized a lot of the values that the silence had sort of pioneered, right? Particularly around things like race, women's rights, and, gay and lesbian rights. It becomes sort of LGBTQ rights a little bit later, right? That terminology doesn't really get used until the millennials are on the scene. They're thinking more just straight gay and lesbian rights. And one of the things that the boomers really embrace is rejecting outdated values, prejudices, and instead they center their lives on individual choice as their kind of core value, right? Everything is about themselves and what they think is right. So they are a generation of rule breakers. So by 1970, most boomers said it was okay to have sex before marriage, for example. Well, most of the silence and the greatest generation said no. 85% of adults said that sex before marriage was wrong in 1967, right? 1967, I guess your oldest boomers would have only been 22. As more of that demographic enters into sort of where we have polling data on them, it fundamentally changes things. And by 1979, it's only 37%. So big changes in sort of the values that people held. The other thing that the boomers are commonly known for is how much they liked using drugs, right? It became more common and acceptable. Weed was always the most common one, but they experimented with all sorts of things, including LSD, mushrooms, acid, all sorts of things, right, that we associate with sort of the counterculture of the 70s in particular. All righty. So, key technologies. Television. So, I know I talked about this when I talked about the silence. For the silence, technology is new. Or sorry, not technology, the TV. So for the silence, TV is new. For the boomers, TV is dominant. It has become the dominant sort of medium of their lives. By the time that they're kind of in their late teens, early 20s, virtually all American households have at least one television. Increasingly, a lot of American households have at least one color television. And basically, it kind of does a lot of the things that I talked about with the silence, but it's so much more ingrained for the boomers. Whereas for the silence, it sort of gave them a taste of the broader world. For the boomers, they're so ensconced with television that it is their kind of window into the world, right? So in some ways, it expands their horizons, right? You get to see a lot of things brought to the comfort of your own home through things like television news. And this is the era, of sort of the great newsmen, the Walter Cronkites that are sort of legendary in the media industry, right? That brought the news of the world to people's living rooms, right? In a way that was much more visceral and visual than before. And it showed, what was happening all over the world in ways that older media couldn't, right? So especially things like the Vietnam War, right? The horrors of the Vietnam War and all of the terrible things that the US Army was doing to the Vietnamese people was beamed into people's living rooms. And it became much harder for governments, say, to control what was making it onto the screens. Prior to this, if you were getting like war footage, it was typically shown in movie theaters. But here, war footage, increasingly was beamed into people's households. Okay, so television is a big one. These other two technologies, though, I think arguably, and I guess like this is a constellation of technologies, but I'll talk about it in a second. Arguably, these, I think, have a bigger impact, right? The birth control pill and other contraceptives, because other contraceptives come on the market very quickly. The idea that women could control their fertility in a very granular way obviously has a lot of impacts. So, like I said, it's introduced roughly in 1960. Canada's a little bit later. We don't have it kind of fully approved until about 1967. But it has this very particular effect of breaking apart, sort of facts of human life, right? That, prior to the advent of contraception, broadly, if people started having sex, eventually a pregnancy was going to ensue, barring some kind of medical problem. And so sex was very risky for women, right? From an economic, from a social perspective. And so it was very strongly socially controlled, right? And we think of it, these times as very prudish in lots of ways. But the 1940s and 50s are periods of, quite dense social controls around sex, specifically because, sex and conception are still very much connected, and kind of prior cultural attempts to separate sort of sex and things like marriage had ended in kind of disaster, right? And if you think of the Romantic period in Europe in particular, and people like Lord Byron, right, it left a trail of women, devastated women caring for children whose fathers had abandoned them. So the kind of puritanical or prudishness of the 1950s is kind of a reaction to things that had happened, in the century prior. But the birth control pill allows you to separate sex and babies, right? In a very obvious way. And so it allowed for a lot more sexual experimentation, particularly for women, right? It made it much easier to try having sex at younger ages and not risk kind of the negative economic consequences of an unplanned pregnancy. Now, I say to a degree because obviously contraception, even at the best of times, fails occasionally, which will lead to unplanned and unintended pregnancies. And so the fact that, contraception is only kind of successful to a degree led to the other big cultural fight the boomers were really passionate about, which was the fight on abortion rights. So as the boomers sort of enter into, emerging adulthood, late teen and emerging adulthood, starting in the 1960s, the campaigns for legalizing abortion rights also ramp up. And obviously in the United States, this takes the form of the Roe v. Wade, kind of Supreme Court decision in 1973, which sort of enshrines the right to abortion, right? because, if women are going to be men and women are going to be sexually experimenting, and pregnancies are going to ensue despite contraception, abortion serves as a kind of backstop, right? A second option, or a last resort when contraception has failed. And again, Canada lags a little bit behind the United States. We don't get fully kind of constitutionally protected abortion in Canada until the 1980s with the Morgentaler decision. Okay. Hang on. I'm going to erase everything I have here. Hang on. I'll give you a second to write. I'm going to sip my water. Okay, so any questions? I'm just going to pause. I've just been blabbing because I love to apparently hear my own voice. That's not a nice thing to admit. Sort of goes with the job. Talking a lot. Okay, no questions? All right, let's talk labor-saving devices. Now, there is a category of historians that will argue that far more revolutionary, particularly for women's rights, than even the birth control pill, was the various labor-saving devices that became common during this period. And here, you're thinking of your washing machine, your dishwasher, your microwave, and potentially, the mighty vacuum, or the vacuum cleaner, right? Okay. So why are these things so important? Well, basically, if we go prior to the invention of these things, a lot of women's time would have been spent, a lot of the labor that women did was domestic labor that was meant to basically allow the family to function, right? And it was really basic things like washing clothes. And it's really hard, I think, from our modern perspective, to understand how much of a pain in the ass washing clothes is when you don't have a washing machine. I remember growing up, my mom still had a washing board, right? And it's like this kind of wooden A-frame with a ridged glass panel in the middle. And she would stick it in, we had a utility sink in the basement. And if there was something with really stubborn stains, right, grass stains or something, she would stick it in there and she would scrub the piece of clothing with soap against that washboard. And I remember her saying, this was what her mother had to do every day, right? My mom is one of 14 kids in her family. So until her mother got her first washing machine in the year 1968, right? My grandmother apparently hand washed all of that family's laundry. So the washing machine, so you had to scrub it, right? Every piece of clothing that you had that got dirty, and imagine living on a family farm, you had to scrub that kind of manually to get it clean. So washing was a huge pain in the butt, as was, washing dishes, right? Imagine all of the crap you put in the dishwasher today. If your dishwasher ever breaks, you start to appreciate the dishwasher really, really quickly, right? You're like, man, that thing that I just load 100 dishes into is much more efficient than me washing every stupid plate, one at a time, right? So the dishwasher, again, something that was predominantly done by women and children was washing dishes. A lot of their time was spent doing this. The microwave, I think a little bit less. Obviously, when it comes out, there's this promise, and the early advertising for the microwave is that you're going to get these, what they call TV dinners, and that you can feed your family in 5 minutes, right? You're going to buy this frozen food from the grocery store, and you're going to feed your whole family by sticking it in the microwave. Obviously, that never quite pans out because the food that you can microwave that comes in those, paper packages is kind of gross. Or shall I say, not the best. It's kind of gross. It's not good. The Michelina's pasta is not good. But it was pitched as a kind of promise that it would save people a lot of time. And then the vacuum, right? The vacuum cleaner, or as our British friends call it, the Hoover, is another one of these really central technologies, because women would have had to do things like, sweep the whole house and then take things like carpets, that were generally not affixed to the floor, and actually take them outside and beat them with a stick. Like you actually used to, you can find pictures of this, of people doing it. You would beat them with a stick to get the dust out of them, right? And hand washing carpets. So all of this stuff took an enormous amount of time. So what happens when you get all of these things is women get to spend so most of women's time prior to this would have been spent doing the tasks that these technologies do much more quickly. Once you have these technologies, women have a ton more time to do things like go to work, right? It becomes possible to balance work and home because these machines are doing part of that work of what Marxists will call social reproduction, right? Of just keeping your workers going and keeping workers kind of happy and productive. Oopsie. A lot of that stuff gets replaced by machines, and it frees up women's time so they can then go in to do wage work without necessarily leaving their children and their husbands in dirty clothes, right? Or, with dishes that aren't washed in the sink, because there just isn't time for everything, right? So there are several historical accounts that suggest that these technologies are far more responsible for, women's liberation than even the birth control pill. Because yes, controlling fertility was important, but it probably wouldn't have made that big a difference if all of these tasks remained ultimately things that were, women did and that they had to do because there's no other way to kind of keep a household going. I guess in some ways, a few of the other things that really come in the post-war period, is much more kind of clothing that's manufactured at much cheaper costs, right? Because the other thing that women often did was make clothing for their children. I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. The reason I laugh is because my mother-in-law grew up on a farm and they were dirt poor. And so even as, when she was an adult and not dirt poor in any way, shape, or form, my father-in-law was an executive at an oil company and they had money. But she would still make clothing for her children. And my wife still remembers this as like traumatic because all her friends were showing up in like whatever Guess jeans or whatever was fashionable. And she's showing up in like homemade sweatpants and like the dress for picture day that her mom made. And they were truly hideous. Like there are pictures. They were awful, like floral patterns. It was terrible. My wife is still traumatized by this. And, even though she can sew, she refuses to do it because it's like a deep and abiding trauma from her childhood of having these like homemade clothing from her mother. But this was another thing that women did, right? Clothing gets much cheaper and a much greater availability of canned goods. Because the other thing that women used to do was a lot of growing things in a garden and canning preserves that you would basically, keep for the winter. And as you get, more canned goods that are more easily available and more kind of, aircraft shipping and other forms of international shipping with big scale refrigeration, you start to get fresh fruit all through the winter. I could just tell weird anecdotes of things that my parents have told me through this whole section because my parents are boomers. When my parents were young, right? So one of the things that they recount is they lived on preserves from the garden through most of the winter, except one thing, which was what they called Christmas oranges, which you would call mandarins, right? Because weirdly, they grow at a different season. So they would show up kind of fresh in grocery stores around Christmas, whereas all the other fruit was kind of off the shelves, other than bananas, but both my parents hate bananas for some reason. But now, obviously, with refrigeration and all of the crazy technology we have, much more fresh fruit available, which means women don't have to can food. So a lot of the tasks that women used to do that was part of their economic life and how they contributed to the family gets automated. It gets done by factories. It's done by these machines, and that frees up a ton of their time to go to work, and it makes it possible for them to do so. Okay. So, individualism. boomer individualism. And probably, you know, okay, arguably, the boomers are just kind of the next step in the evolution of individualism. Certainly, they are the most individualistic generation that had come so far by the time they appear on the scene, right? Whereas their parents were much more communitarian and community focused, the boomers are very, very individualistic. So, what happens? The boomers, kind of go through, and again, the last of the boomers are just entering adulthood. I guess they're born in 1962. They're entering kind of adulthood around 1980, right? The bulk of the boomers have already entered, or they're well into emerging adulthood, or they've actually entered their 30s. But what happens is they give up a lot of their kind of rebellious practices, right? In the, by the time they get through the 1970s and into the beginning of the 1980s, right? They start to grow up a little bit. They stop being the generation that rejects all social norms, and they calm down a bit, right? And this is where, in the 1980s, a lot of the people who had been part of the sort of revolutionary culture of kind of women's lib and the hippie movement, they get married, they have kids, and they get regular jobs, sometimes referred to as selling out. It's a very common term at the time. So they don't the same kind of social forces, though, and the same kind of psychological forces that had really been, responsible for their rejection of social norms, continues to be quite important. And it just kind of shifts its focus. By the 1980s, instead of rejecting social norms, it becomes all about self-discovery. And we really get in the 1980s, and for the boomers, the beginnings of what you would call the self-help movement, right? So there's the whole section of self-help books and self-help manuals that we have today, right? That people put out all the time. How to find yourself, how to discover who you truly are. This is really a sort of result of the boomers, right? They start this quest of self-discovery, and the rest of their lives is really dominated by this quest for self-discovery. Okay, so how does this individualism play out? In all sorts of ways, right? The way that they raise their kids, the way that they handle marriage, right? And we see much more divorce for the boomers after they get married. All sorts of ways that their individualism and their quest for, happiness and self-fulfillment plays out in society. One of the weird ones is in the way they name their children. And this actually gets much, much worse as we get into, Gen X and then the millennials. So, names used to be a way to fit in, right? In the 1880s, half of boys were given 10 names, and a quarter of girls were given the 10 most popular baby names. 100 years later, when the boomers started naming their children, only 1 in 5 received the most popular names, and since 2010, it is only 1 out of 14. And this is where you get, this is the one. Things like this, and people not only choosing unique names, but choosing unique spellings. By the time you get to Gen X and then the millennials, we're so focused on the idea that someone's name is going to be something that makes them stand out, right? That is going to be something that's unique just to them, that expresses, your parental hope for who they're going to be, or that they're going to be the only one in their class with this name. My sister-in-law is funny. They named my niece, their daughter, Ruby, and they were like, there's not going to be any other Rubies. There's another Ruby in her class, and she is still salty about it. There were only 5 Rubies born in Alberta in the year she was born, and one of them is in her class. So I always find it's funny. It's like they wanted a completely unique name that no one else would have. And I find it hilarious that it didn't work out, because I'm a bad person, and I experience Schadenfreude, the pleasure and the pain of others, and a lot. I experience this a lot. It's my favorite emotion, actually. I can't wait until the Toronto Maple Leafs lose so I can experience the Schadenfreude of Leaf fans all over again in a glorious feast on the pain of others. Because I'm a bad person, but I really enjoy it. Don't take it away from me. Okay, so Schadenfreude, a German word. Weirdly, the word that means taking pleasure in the pain of others is German. Who would have guessed? Okay, so yeah, names are getting more and more unique, right, as we move through and people become more and more focused on individualism. Okay, so the boomers, how did they do? Well, they did much worse than their parents in terms of mental health, right? So the boomers have reported struggling with mental health at 2 to 3 times the rate that the silents did at the same age. It starts in their college years, right? So it starts kind of 18 to 23, 24, and has persisted into their late 70s, right? Because our oldest boomers are turning 80 this year. The suicide rate for boomers considerably higher than it was for the silents. Okay, and an American born 1964, right, the last year for the boomers, 35 times more likely to take their own life than someone born in 1935, right? So middle part of the silent generation. Once they aged, right, so into their the 45 to 54 demographic, so as they entered kind of middle age, I say that sadly as someone who's trending there, they started to suffer. Sorry, that sounded like someone knocking. It was just a cup. I was going to say I am the one who knocks, but that would be weirdly inappropriate. Deaths of despair, right? They started to suffer from more deaths of despair, particularly things like suicide, which is obviously, you know, our number one death of despair, but other things like overdose, especially from opioids, right? The opioid epidemic that people talk about really starts with the boomers when they're 45 to 54. And liver failure, right? Liver failure is a sign of excess alcohol consumption. And so it is, you know, considered a death of despair, right? So the boomers are the leaders on deaths of despair. And once they hit, and that one's mostly amongst working class white people, especially working class white men in the US. Once they hit 55 to 64, the death rate for boomers rises for all the demographics, right? So Latinos, Blacks, Indigenous, all demographics, it rises precipitously for our deaths of despair, or for deaths, despite things like heart disease and cancer rates actually declining, or death rates from cancer and heart disease declining. So the theory that Twenge suggests is that this might have to do with less stable relationships and their increased individualism, which causes people to be less integrated and lonely. And we start to see with the boomers, you know, a trend that we're going to see sort of accelerate with Gen X, with millennials then, and with Gen Z, is an exit from institutions, or what we'll call, you know, formally deinstitutionalizations. Wow, deinstitutionalization. It's a long word. Deinstitutionalization, right? Now, the boomers don't do it as much as, say, the Gen X, millennials, and Gen Zers will do. We're going to see that this trend picks up in ways that are going to cause problems for our millennials and Gen Z in particular. But the boomers have much smaller families, right? They have a lot of siblings, but few children, right? By the 1970s, like for instance, in Canada, by 1972, sort of the beginning of the fertility window for the boomers, we've dropped below replacement fertility, right? So they're having less than 2 children on average per woman. So they have few children, lots of siblings, few children, even fewer grandchildren. Right? And they start to exit institutions, particularly things like, religion, right? Religion's one of the first ones. My red changed. Okay, I'm going to change to a friendlier color here. I'm tired of red. I'm going to go green. Religion, right? So that's blue. That's not green at all. There we go. Religion is one of the first ones, right? We start to see a retreat from religion amongst the boomers. This will accelerate once we talk about Gen X. I really wish they named the generations a little bit differently. Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, right? But things like religion, but other things like clubs, political parties, bowling leagues, all of these things are things that gradually the baby boomers start to withdraw themselves from and spend much less time in institutional context than the silents had. So, all right. Are the boomers the same generation that had the hippie movement? So, yes and no. The hippie movement kind of overlaps a little bit between the silents and the boomers, right? So we're talking about kind of hippies more in the 1960s. You're talking there probably more about the silents. When you're talking about them in the 1970s, they've been joined by some of the oldest baby boomers, right? So it's a little bit of a transgenerational kind of cultural moment that encompasses sort of the end of the silents and the beginning of the baby boomers. It's a good question. Okay. How are you feeling? Would you like to take a 15-minute pause and come back at 2:30? And then we'll start on Gen X for a nice inflection point. Okay, let's say 15, 20 minutes, come back at, let's say 35. Let's say 35. We'll take a little bit of a break and then we'll start talking about Gen X because I've been bombarding you with data or information, and this is a good place to start. All right, we'll see you in a couple minutes. Tears in my eyes. It was a gift from a student, so okay. I didn't make it myself. I feel like that would be dark if I'm like, these are my students' tears. Yes, it is.
so you don't think I'm being like rude
Oh.
and just like storming at her. or anything.
I never think that. I'm usually like, people have stuff going on. And
Okay, awesome.
especially like 10 minutes early. It's just like, you have somewhere to be.
Yeah, okay, awesome. Thanks.
No worries. Okay. Do. Flip that over. So, all right. Sorry, getting my head back in the game. I refilled my water, so let's go. Gen X or Generation X. Children of kind of those later, the older silents and sort of the younger baby boomers, born 1965 to 1979. So, what was the experience of Gen X? So that the first ones to have technology. Geez, I'm going to screw that up all day. Television, really present since birth, but especially cable television for an increasing number of them, especially those in the wealthy middle class, right? Increasingly had cable TV available to them. So they would have been, how to put this? The first generation that started to have some choice, right? That started to have some choice about what kind of media they were consuming. Now, that said, most of them still had, typically between 1 and 4 television channels that they grew up with. And so Gen X, in a lot of ways, is the last generation to have what you would call a really shared culture, where essentially everybody was consuming the same media. Now, this changes as they get older, right? As cable TV becomes more and more enshrined, more choices are there and culture starts to fragment. But at least in their early days, right, Gen X had very much a shared culture because he had, between 1 and 4 TV channels. On those channels, obviously, were a limited number of television shows and genres. And so people were consuming broadly the same media. And this is why, for instance, there's one particular series called MASH, right? Which aired in the 70s and in the 1980s. Stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, right? It was a kind of sitcom about the Korean War, kind of. The series finale of MASH, which ran 11 seasons, is still, and it went off the air in, I want to say 1982. It, to this day, remains the most watched television event in history, simply because there was so little choice, right? There were, I think, 4 stations at the time, and everybody was basically watching MASH. So it had been the biggest show for a long time, and when it went off the air, it remained that way. So Gen X has a very unified culture, right? They're all watching the same things. They all consume roughly the same culture. There's not a ton of choice. Okay. I'm going to erase all of that. Sometimes people will say that this is the last generation to have an analog rather than a digital childhood. Basically, for Gen X, there is no internet, right? At least not in their their teenage and emerging adult years, right? The internet it starts to, sorry, let me back up a sec. The internet, as kind of what you and me think of it, really becomes kind of commercially available, where you can buy internet access from a service provider in and around 1995, 1996, right? So at this point, the oldest of your Gen Xers are 30 years old, and even the younger ones, right, are well into adolescence before the internet really makes a huge impact. So their childhood is almost entirely analog, right? That's not digital. It's not being influenced by the internet really in any way, right? there's really only kind of a few of them that are 15, right, when the internet becomes commercially available. So, and it doesn't impact evenly. So, last with the analog rather than digital childhood, of which they are very proud, by the way. If you ever kind of talk to people who are Gen X, right, they talk about how they spent all of their time outside, right, how they didn't live on screens and all of this. This is very much who they are. Okay, in the US anyway, they're the first generation that was not drafted into the military. So they are, they see the benefits of kind of the post-Vietnam reforms in the US military system, right? And the US, well, if you're male and kind of turn 18, you still have to register for selective service. No one's been drafted in a long time. The US starts to run an entirely volunteer army, right? So the army is entirely made up of volunteers. So military service stops being as universal a touchstone as it was for, say, the baby boomers and the silent generation, many of whom would have served in the U.S. military. I mean, for the silents, a lot of them would have served in Korea, right? They would have been mostly too young to serve in World War II, but some of them would have served in Korea. And quite a few of them might have served in Vietnam as well, as did some of the kind of older part of the baby boomers. But this idea that you might be drafted into military service is not something that Gen X really thinks about, because that particular way of building an army goes away. So they also grow up during the height of the Cold War, right? The Cold War between the communists led by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the democracies of the world, or what's sometimes called the free world, led by the United States of America. Wow, how little things change. So, obviously this is a period of a ton of cultural tension and of historic tension, and especially a fear that you would have, a nuclear apocalypse raining down upon you, right? And at least at a couple of points in their lifetimes, the Soviet Union and the United States are at loggerheads, and conflict seems near. And it's not really until the 1980s that you get the really strong détente under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. So, it's a time where, the Cold War is at an all-time, like a high pitch. Competition between the Soviets and the Americans, is going strong, and there's a real fear that the whole world might end in a nuclear apocalypse. And there's like TV movies. What was it titled? It was like The Day After the End or something. This is one that Reagan watched and was horrified by, which sought him to lead peace accords seek peace accords with the Soviet Union. But movies about what would happen after a nuclear exchange between the Soviets and the Americans, and things like The Last Man on Earth and all of these sorts of things. Okay, so, let's not undersell the thought that they all thought they were going to die in a nuclear apocalypse and move on to our next point so casually by saying so and jumping off to it. But so, I talked about this, already. More cultural or less cultural fragmentation, particularly than the generations that are going to come after them, the millennials and Gen Z. And they are the first generation really to grow up with video games, right? And they get that first generation of video games, popularized by things like, the Atari, and then the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, and eventually, right, and then like Sega Master System, then the Super NES, and the Sega Genesis, and so on, right? I read a book on the battle between Sega and Nintendo. And it's a fascinating story of the video game wars that the Gen Xers lived through. Okay, So the first ones to grow up with video games, right? I guess first video games were available in arcades, and then eventually they're available at home through these home video game systems, and then eventually too on computers, though computer games remain, very paltry until much, much later. Okay, so first ones to grow up with video games. Maybe I'll just erase a few things here. They are the generation that experiences a lot of the marital breakdown that comes from reforms to divorce laws that affect both the silents and also affect the kind of baby boomers who are married, right? In Canada, you have two reforms, one in the 1960s, one in the 1980s, both of which spike the divorce rates. In the US, it's a little bit more uneven because it's state by state, but basically no-fault divorce becomes the norm in the US by the 1980s. So you have a much higher rate of divorce, and they experience the divorce of their silent and older boomer parents. And they are, in some ways, the first and last of what are called the latchkey kids, right? So latchkey kid is a particular term that came out kind of, in the 1970s mostly, 70s and 80s, I guess, to talk about, the Gen X kids. And the latchkey kids were, kids that would, that had keys to their own house and that let themselves in after school. Because where was mom? Well, mom was at work, right? So they would let themselves in after school, often starting in like the first or second grade, make themselves a snack, and then, hang out at home, probably watching television until their parents came home, right? So they're called the latchkey kids. And in some ways, it's suggested that they are the first of them. This isn't really true, but it's when it becomes really kind of noticed culturally that this is happening to a lot of kids. But like we said, or like I said, you didn't say anything. For the silents, 1 in 3 of their mothers were working. And this, accelerates, with every generational cohort. It's just that for Gen X, it becomes kind of culturally salient. And there comes to be this kind of backlash against, especially women, who are out in the workplace, not at home caring for their kids. This will become especially acute when Gen X goes through a bit of a teen pregnancy crisis, right? Because amongst other things that happens is, as they enter adolescence, a lot of them go home and have, bring over their significant others and have sex with them, and some of them end up pregnant. So there's a big spike in teen pregnancies in Gen X. And again, it's like, who gets blamed for this? It's mom for being at work, not there, keeping an eye on your kids and stopping them from having sex, or whatever it happens to be, right? Okay, so in some ways, they're thought of as the first of them, and then somewhat thought of as the last of them, because following this, and really with the millennials, and then certainly with Gen Z, you get a proliferation of after-school care, which really didn't exist, or barely existed, prior to the millennials. Okay. So according to Twenge, what does Gen X look like when they're in these kind of teen and early adult years, right? Well, there's marriage, there's sex, and children, not necessarily in that order. So there's a lot of flexibility, and there starts to be much more flexibility in how you construct your life course, right? And what happens in what order. Some of that kind of consensus as, you meet your significant other in high school or in college, and you go through a process of dating and, courtship and dating. All of that has kind of broken down by the time we hit Gen X. Oops, that should be of, sorry. That should be flexibility of sex lives and family life, right? The order gets kind of scrambled. So young people are having sex at much earlier ages with in Gen X. And so what Twenge says is they have a very short childhood and a very long adolescence. So it's not super uncommon, for Gen X for people to start, having sex around 13 years old, though the norm is probably closer to 15 or 16. But you have a not insignificant number of young people having sex for the first time as early as 13 years old. They also get married much later than any previous generation, right? The average age at first marriage for women is 25. For men, it's 27. And this is going to continue to creep up for millennials and for Gen Z. And the gap between when they become sexually active and when they get married gets considerably shorter, right? So for early boomer women had sex for only about 2 years before getting married. Gen X, on the other hand, it gets longer, went 7 years between losing their virginity and walking down the aisle. So sex and marriage get quite decoupled, right? They become sexually active earlier, they're getting married later, and so that gap between when they, become sexually active and get married gets longer. Okay, and not inconsequentially, as you uncouple children from marriage, what do you get? Or what do you get when you start having sex earlier and getting married later? You end up uncoupling children from marriage, right? So in 1960, 1 in 20 children were born to unwed mothers. By 1980, it's 1 in 6, right? And by 1993, again, and this is going to be mostly Gen Xers having children at this point, it's 1 in 3, right? 1 in 3 by 1993. So a lot of children being born before their mothers get married and all of this stuff, right? And this one, I always find this a funny little quirk. The age of mother at birth of first child dipped below the age of first marriage for the first time. So there's a bunch of cultural norms that sort of start to change and break down here, right? The stigma against unwed mothers definitely breaks down amongst Gen X's cohort, right? It's no longer seen as big of a problem or even that big of a problem. And definitely you get the disappearance of, the phenomenon of what you would call a shotgun wedding, right? Where in the past, if woman got pregnant, typically whoever got them pregnant would then kind of be forced to marry that person, right? I don't know. There's probably a cultural term for it, which is escaping me at the moment. I think this is entirely the plot of the sitcom Georgie and Mandy's First Marriage. It is mostly this phenomenon, although that sitcom's set later than this. But what happens obviously with Gen X is that's no longer the case, right? So, let me put it this way. If we go back in kind of our marriage records and we compare things like, marriages and births, there's a lot of babies born 7 months after marriages, right? Or 8 or 6 months after marriages. Why? Because basically, someone got pregnant, wedding happened really, really quick. And so technically you keep your age of the mother at first marriage at least the same as the age at which they have their first child. This breaks down with Gen X, right? And you get pregnant, you just have the kid, you don't necessarily get married. So suddenly that age of women at the birth of their first child dips below the age at first marriage, right? And this never reverses. This stays the way it is. Okay. So, carrying on this trend that I talked about with the baby boomers, right? This trend of self-discovery, cultural forces generally don't just stop, right? So all of the trends that were sort of picking up steam once the boomers were done with their, rebellious phase, and the hippie generation, the sex, free love, sex and rock and roll and all of that stuff, and they switch into kind of this self-help mode, all of that is the kind of, I don't know, I'm going to mix metaphors here. It's I'm going to not use a metaphor. It's the world that Gen X is born into, right? Is a self-help kind of world. And they are very much raised by parents who are themselves consuming things like self-help books on how to raise children, right? Suddenly the wisdom of how you raise a child stops being something that's communal and shared, and you start going to parenting experts, the very famous, at the time, Dr. Spock. Not the Star Trek character. There was actually a guy named Dr. Spock who was apparently a parenting expert. And his book sold like hundreds of millions of copies. Okay. Loving yourself and self-help become major trends. And kids during this generation are taught that self-esteem is paramount, right? And you see this reflected, in some of the culture of the time, particularly shows like Sesame Street and even like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, right? Really focus on these kinds of themes of self-esteem and, self-actualization and all of these sorts of things. Okay, so we see this, right? Use of the word self-focus and self-esteem in American books, 1950 to 2019. You see this big sort of, spike in it when Gen X is kind of in that marketplace, right? When they're young. So, in the early 1950s, only 12% of teens agreed with the statement, "I am an important person." By the late 1980s, 80% of teens claimed that they were important, right? So people start to think of themselves as very important, right? Unique individuals that have something unique to contribute to the world. Now, again, this is something that when we talk about the millennials in a couple of minutes, is very much a characteristic of the millennials as well. And Twenge herself wrote a couple of books on millennials, one called The Narcissism Epidemic. I hear some of you snickering. Do you know millennials that you think are narcissistic? And the other one was Generation Me. About the millennials, right? So she writes books about generations all the time. But these trends that we see starting in Gen X, again, are going to carry through to the millennials. But you start to see this shift in thinking, growing individualism and a growing sense that each person is unique and important and special, and an important person, right? This becomes part of the cultural zeitgeist, right? You go from 12% of teenagers saying that they're an important person to 80% of teenagers saying that they're an important person. I was going to make a joke about my teenage daughter, but perhaps I shall restrain myself. She definitely thinks she's an important person. So important that everyone else in her life has to wait for her for at least 20 minutes every time she needs to do something. Okay, I said it. I'm not bitter. It was hard getting her in the car this morning. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, Gen X. Also a kind of culmination of a growing desire for unabashed materialism, right? They want stuff, right? They want things, they want possessions, and they increasingly think that the goal of life, right, should be, money, fame, and image rather than other things, right? So what Twenge says is for Gen X, life goals shifted from intrinsic things, right, meaning of life, ideas, helping others, to extrinsic things, right, money, fame, and image. And obviously, right, we see this continuing on as well with millennials and Gen Z in lots of ways, right? Especially, I think, with Gen Z, one of them that's really, at least for some of them, fame is really, really important. Okay. we see this in some of the college data, right? And this comes from a great study, that goes back all the way to the 1960s, called the American Freshman Survey. And I never cease to be amazed by the quality and depth of American social science data, that there's some organization out there that's been surveying college freshmen since the 1960s, and that you can go and download that data and mess around with it. Always makes me jealous, because Canada has nothing like this. Okay, so looking at this college freshman data, college students in Gen X, right, and the gray part here is Gen X, are much more likely to say that we're much less likely to say that developing a meaningful philosophy of life was important, and much more likely to say that being financially well off was important, right? So, and again, this only accelerates with millennials and Gen Z. Now, again, we see this kind of crossover with the baby boomers. So if we look here, right, when the baby boomers sort of enter the scene in the 1960s, people would have said that developing, a meaningful philosophy of life, 85% of people said that, compared to only like 42, 43% of people saying that, being financially well off was important. As we get deeper into the baby boomer era, right, that meaningful philosophy of life goes down. Those extrinsic things, money, fame, and all that jazz, go up. And you have a crossover sometime around 1978, 1979, where, financially well off becomes more important. And by the time, and again, this is not something that the Gen Xers invented, they sort of inherit this from the boomers, right? Nobody by this point cares. Okay, it's like still almost 45%. But fewer people care about a meaningful philosophy of life, and there's much more of a focus on material well-being. That's an interesting question. No. To this day, actually, laws governing like child welfare and how long you can leave kids alone are notoriously vague in most jurisdictions. Like in Alberta, the actual kind of legal statute for how long you can leave a child unattended is that you have to judge based on the maturity of the child what is a reasonable amount of time that child could be left unattended. So it comes down to very much a judgment call, but it's not like, at 6 years old, they can be alone for an hour. It's like, okay, if they're 5 and they're fine, you could technically leave them alone for 6 to 10 hours, right? As long as, you don't think they're going to put themselves in harm's way. It's more of a cultural transformation that happens. One of the things that really happens, particularly in the 1980s, is there's these series of moral panics about things like kidnapping, right? There are some really high-profile kidnapping cases that happen in, say, like the late 1970s, early 1980s, where children like disappear and are never seen again. And it's like, oh my gosh, they must have been kidnapped by a stranger. There's a very famous case that happened in Edmonton. I can't remember her given name, but it was her nickname was Punky Gustafson, right? And for a long time, she just disappeared one day. Supposedly, she was picked up by some like white Econoline van, never to be seen again. And this remains an unsolved case in the Edmonton Police Service's roster, right? This was not alone, right? This happened in Edmonton, but these happened kind of all across North America. And people freaked out about leaving their kids alone, right? That their kids were going to be kidnapped. I grew up in this era, right? I was born in the beginning of the 1980s, in 1982. And so I kind of lived through a lot of this. And I remember like all of these instructional videos at school as to how to handle it. If someone pulls over and asks you for directions, right? It's like, step back, make sure you're not within arm's reach of the stranger. No one in my childhood ever pulled over and asked me for directions, ever. It was completely useless information. But there was this moral panic, and there was like, cartoons for kids that like little like public service announcements that told you how to deal with strangers pulling over, all this crazy thing. So it's more of a cultural thing. People have this like cultural reaction. It's like, okay, well, we need something for kids to do. And so they found like after school programs. It's like latchkey kids are in danger, right? They might burn down their house or get pregnant or get kidnapped by a stranger. And they create these sort of after school programs for young people, so that, you know, things like out of school care to keep young people safe and monitored until their parents come home. Corrine, yes, you're right. Corrine Punky Gustafson, that's right. For years later, people would still phone in tips like, I think I saw the white van, in ways that I know drove the EPS absolutely crazy. And also ignored like the fact that most kidnappings are done by family members or people known to the, you know, known to the child who's kidnapped. It's almost always a divorced parent. But yeah, it's more of a cultural thing, right? The laws haven't really changed that much in terms of how long you can leave kids alone. Not that I looked this up to figure out how long I could leave my kids alone, but you know, this knowledge circulates. Other parents will tell you this, and they'll be like, you know, you can leave your kids alone for any amount of time that's reasonable. I'm like, cool. My kids will burn the house down, but you know, you do what you want. My 5-year-old, I'm pretty sure I could leave him alone for about 8 minutes and something would be broken. How does the West turn to neoliberalism with Reagan, Thatcher, and Mulroney shift generational perspectives? This is a really interesting question. I talk about this a little bit when I talk about work, but let me try to answer it. It's a little bit. It's such a broad cultural moment that it's a little bit difficult to talk about. I would say that the shift to neoliberalism is part of something that's already baked into the cake, right? It's something that's already happening by the time Reagan and Thatcher and Mulroney come around, right? There's a disaffection with, you know, big bloated nation states. You know, high public debts, and especially, can I write on my slide? The idea, you know, stagflation. Because in the 1970s, right, you get a moment, a cultural and economic moment called stagflation, and this is particularly under someone like Jimmy Carter, right, where you have high inflation. And low economic growth, basically Canada in 2025. Okay, that's not quite fair. The inflation was much higher in the US at that point, and economic growth was basically flat. And so people have already been trending right in this direction. The boomers are already becoming more materialistic, and so they're particularly, I think, open to a neoliberal argument that says, we're gonna lower your taxes, we're gonna generate growth, and we're going to cut these pesky social programs that are, you know, forcing you to pay really, really high taxes. And so I think it, you know, rather than maybe your question is a little bit backwards here, I think a shift in a generational perspective probably left people open to neoliberalism more so than neoliberalism sort of shifted their perspective, right? They were ready, I think, for someone like Ronald Reagan to come around and tell them these things. And right, obviously, Reagan had a lot of backing from like the Chicago School of Economics and someone like Milton Friedman. You know, so the ideas had been circulating for a while. But I think it just sort of catches because people are already becoming more materialistic, individualistic, and they're sick of, you know, paying high taxes. So and especially they're sick of inflation and economic stagnation. Which really kind of starts at the, you know, in maybe 1973, and then kind of carries on there, and Reagan just takes advantage. Okay, I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm going to go with, I answered it brilliantly, but it's a great question. Oh wow, 3:11 already. You adjusted your glasses and I got excited. I thought you had a question, but no, I see, just fixing your glasses. Okay, so mental health for Gen X. Gen X generally we think of as having had really poor mental health as teenagers. And one of the kind of weird statistics is that they had nearly double the rate of suicides as teenagers compared with the boomers. However, their mental health gets better as they get older, right? So, I mean, this chart's a little bit hard to read. I don't love the data visualization here because it is a little bit, it's a little bit tough. But what we see, right, when the boomers were, 26, so when Gen X is 26, in that 26 to 40 demographic, right, we see them kind of, fairly depressed. As they get older, right, as they're more in this demographic, we see their kind of depression stats going down. So again, I don't love the way that this is organized, but you can kind of make of it what you will. Okay. Now this statistic's a little bit of a weird one, and I want to maybe put it into context. This increase in suicides for Gen X also coincides with the loosening of gun laws in the US. It becomes a lot easier to get a gun in this period. And this is really the period in which, you start to see the proliferation of firearms in American society, which hadn't been the case in the past, right? But gun law, there's lots of challenges led by groups like the NRA to laws restricting gun access in the US. And it kind of hits when Gen X is relatively young. And so there's a lot of guns floating around in this period. And one of the things we know is that, suicides that use guns, for obvious reasons, are much more successful than other forms of suicide. So that once the gun laws are tightened down a bit, again, say in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, this number goes back down and things look a little bit more sane. Okay. This is where, unfortunately, I've decided to attack you with 3 charts at once because I don't like myself and I like explaining slides with too many charts. Okay, no, they're all on a theme, so I wanted to put them together. One of the other things that marks Gen X is declining social trust. And generally speaking, we think of Gen X as a pretty cynical generation, one that has particularly low trust, as teenagers, in things like government, right? This may be a reflection of a bunch of government scandals, right? They're living in the wake of things like the Watergate scandal in the US. And even, so here, let me, Watergate, which happens in the 70s. And then what's sometimes lovingly referred to as Zippergate, which is Bill Clinton's sex scandal in the 1990s. Never forget that Bill Clinton is a piece of garbage, especially when it comes to his treatment of women. So we have a bunch of political scandals that roil different kind of eras of American life. That's my clock. I need that back. Particularly Watergate in the 70s, and then Zippergate the Bill Clinton sex scandal in the 1990s. So this erodes a degree of trust in institutions. There's also really, really high crime in the 1980s, right? The 1980s are really the sort of peak for crime in the United States and Canada. It'll peak roughly around 1989 and then start to decline really, really rapidly. So crime is, especially violent crime, is especially high in the 1980s. But other things like rising economic inequality might also play a role. And here, we can connect this to Reagan and neoliberalism in major ways, right? One of the things that happens is a weakening of the union movement, and that neoliberal kind of moment really empowers corporations. And you start to see the gap between kind of average incomes and the incomes of the wealthiest widen, right? And obviously now we're at a period where it's very wide, but it starts to widen in the 1970s and 80s, and then again through the 1990s. That said, trust in government stays relatively high. Okay, let's read some of these charts. Trust in others, right? So this is from another great longitudinal study called Monitoring the Future that interviews 8th, 10th, and 12th graders and asks them a whole series of questions. So what you see, right, is a general drop in the perception that people are helpful, that you can trust people, and that most people are fair, right? Questions are, would you say most of the time people try to be helpful, or are they just looking out for themselves, right? So you see, at the beginning of the Gen X cohort, it's relatively high, and then it drops a solid like 20 or 10%. What's the other one? Do you think most people would try to take advantage of you if you gave them a chance, right? Would you trust them? That one kind of drops off as well. And then generally speaking, would you say most people can be, that's the trust one, trusted or that you can't be too careful when dealing with people, right? So fairness, trust, right? All of these things kind of drop off. Okay, trust in government, government run for the people versus for big interests, and people running the government are honest. We see the biggest drop, I think, in people running the government are honest, which is probably not surprising, given the fact that we found out Nixon in particular was particularly dishonest, and then that Bill Clinton had been stooping the interns, in the Oval Office and lying about it. So that one's not surprising, but the other ones don't change too much. And then this one, right, lack of social trust, right, that's our gray line, rises, right, and goes up from kind of a -2 to around 1.5, and income inequality rises at the same time, right? So we see a kind of correlation between income inequality rising and a lack of social trust and cohesion rising. I think the other thing that's happening too is, again, deinstitutionalization. People are less engaged in communities, right? People have moved out to the suburbs. And so a lot of these really cohesive communities have kind of broken down. All right, the millennials. Hang on, do I have another question slide? All right, the millennials. Oh, the millennials. Hi, that's me. 1982, that's where I'm at. Right at the beginning of the millennial cohort. And I love this number, it's not my number, because my sister, who's 2 years older than me, born in 1980, she will always insist that she is not a millennial, that she is Gen X. And I have to always point out to her, it's like, no, Gen X, my sister and I don't get along. Have I mentioned that? We never have. We'll hear more about her as I need to make jokes about desperate cat ladies. No, nothing wrong with desperate cat ladies. 1980, right, my sister's born in 1980. That's the start of the millennials. And it ends, 1994. So just a thing to note, these generational cohorts are getting shorter, right? And this is sort of the technological change that Twenge's talking about. So, millennials. I should preface this a little bit because I'm going to draw for millennials from a couple of sources. So I'm going to draw from Generations again, Generations, and some other work from Jean Twenge. But I'm also going to draw some information from the National Study of Youth and Religion, and particularly books that were written about the millennials out of that study, not necessarily religious questions, by Christian Smith and I think Patricia Snell in particular, because they did this big snapshot of kind of millennials when they were in their teen and emerging adult years that I think tells us a lot about them. Okay, so what are some qualities of the millennials? A firm belief in self-expression, right? The only person you have to impress is yourself. I wish I felt like that. I wouldn't check rate my professor all the time. No, I'm kidding. I only check it twice a term. Once at the beginning, once at the end. Otherwise it hurts too much. Focused on the self-gratification and self-esteem. And this is Twenge, right? Giving rise to a generation of narcissists, believing they are special, entitled, or superior. And again, I just want to stress, not as a defensive thing because I'm a millennial, but that this is a trend that starts with the baby boomers, carries on to Gen X, and the millennials are just sort of, in a sense, the end point up to that point, where Twenge was writing this in Generation Me. None of these trends are unique to the millennials, right? It's not like the millennials invented any of these things. They are just, things that they are inheriting and sort of living through the most developed form of. The rise of the empowered self, right? A firm belief that dreams can become reality. And we'll talk about millennial optimism here, because the millennials are a weirdly optimistic generation, and this continues to be the case. They're very optimistic, right? They can have it all: fun, fame, fortune, and fulfillment. But they're also a pretty stressed out generation. Stress, anxiety, depression were all on the rise, as was suicide. Now, again, we'll see that this kind of movement for the millennials, not really new, right? It kind of starts again with the baby boomers, but it continues past the millennials into Gen Z in, I think, really interesting ways. Okay, what's this? Oh, this is from Twenge's book, right? The millennials dominate the age group in the shaded years, and this is markers of narcissistic personality inventory scores for US college students. And what you see, right, is as the millennials sort of come in, we see a growing sort of narcissism, especially in the sort of early to mid millennials, and then kind of dropping off as you get to the younger millennials here. Okay. Yeah, there's a bit of a rise in apathy amongst millennials, right? Particularly a declining belief in the efficacy of hard work, the power of collective action. Millennials don't get involved in stuff, right? And here, I will say again, if you want to put this in very contemporary terms, we just had an election in Canada just recently, and technically speaking, today there are more millennials. Oh, there's two N's in millennial. I always get that wrong. Millennials. There are more millennials than there are boomers, right? I guess I'll do the... Hang on, I have to erase that. Oh, I erased too much. Oh, dear. It's a Wednesday, guys. Millennials, right, are greater than baby boomers, right? There's more of us. However, more baby boomers showed up to vote. Why? Well, it's precisely this, right? Millennials are pretty disengaged, right? From politics, from collective action, from institutions, from all sorts of things, right? So there's a fall in a sense of personal responsibility, and I think especially civic engagement. And again, we'll see this continue with Gen Z. There's lots of this in Gen Z as well. Okay, sexualized self, right? The millennials became sexually active far earlier than the boomers, and right around the same time as Gen X. So they became sexually active pretty early. So again, short childhood, long adolescence. But they're unique for, their sexual activity becoming increasingly detached from emotional involvement, right? And here we can probably cite two things that, at least one, hookup culture, which we will talk about later in the course. Hookup culture is kind of the culprit here, or the result of this detachment. And the increasing availability of internet pornography also plays a role. Okay, and then especially once they hit kind of emerging adulthood, probably in and around the year 2000, the millennials go through this sort of big transformation in terms of their values, right? They abandon prejudice, persecution, and traditional moral authority about things. I'll answer those questions in a second. Did you say, what is water? Oh my God. Okay. Sorry. I had this. I taught SOS 444, and I was horrified to learn that most of the Gen Z students in the class got all of their news from Yegwave. And it hurts my soul when people say, "What is Watergate?" Maybe because I'm a political junkie and a massive political nerd, amongst my many failings. So I'm going to sigh and answer your question in 1 second. What was I talking about? Okay, right. Millennials become really engaged with questions of kind of gender, race, and sexual orientation, and very much on the side of equality on all of those things, right? And there really is a kind of pivot around the year 2000, where they become really, really interested in these questions. The biggest one here, I think, is probably sexual orientation, right? LGBTQ rights really break through with the millennials, I think, is into popular consciousness, and kind of a majoritarian position where a majority of millennials are strongly in favor of, full LGBTQ rights around marriage and things like this. Okay, but here, it's no big deal, and I think that's important, right? But it's no big deal. And why is it no big deal? Because it's just the right thing to do, right? For millennials, they're just like, well, of course, no discrimination is the right thing to do. Okay. All right. I don't remember the date, so I'm going to look it up. What is the date of Watergate? You know what? Doesn't matter. I don't know. Oh, I was car shopping before. I wonder why. Watergate. What was the year? Can you find it before I can? Oh, 72. Okay. So, in 1972, Richard Nixon, the then U.S. president, basically ordered two cronies to break into the headquarters of the opposition party, the Democrats, which was in the Watergate Hotel. They stole documents, right? And basically they were trying to get a look at the Democrat strategy for the upcoming election. Now, they got caught and arrested, and this all came out. So basically, like, you're not supposed to spy on, and especially use government resources to spy on the other party, right? This is bad form and kind of illegal. And so what happens is this is discovered, and Nixon is essentially forced to resign from the office of president under a ton of pressure, because he is about to be impeached. And if it goes to the actual Congress, he would have been impeached and he would have been kicked out of office. The only president to ever have done so. So that is Watergate. And again, it's this moment of like, oh, maybe the president is actually kind of a bad dude. And politicians, like, we can't really trust them because they're more out, they're not so much in it for kind of public interest as out for themselves, right? And that seems like a very normal understanding of politicians now. But at the time, people had this kind of faith in the office of the president, especially, that somehow, the wisdom of the people would only lead to the election of good, of someone good and morally upright. And possibly because the media had relentlessly, covered up how much of a absolute womanizer and sexual abuser someone like John F. Kennedy was. The media knew all about it, but they covered it up. And they didn't cover up for Nixon. Probably wouldn't have been possible. Okay, so that's Watergate. Why did the crime rate increase in the 1980s? Okay. This is my intro to crim. So it kind of peaks in the 1980s. It had actually been sort of slowly rising since the 1960s, and there's all sorts of theories as to why this is. I think probably the most reasonable one is that, hang on. I need to write. Hang on, I'm going to write. Your general profile of someone who commits crime is my pen. No. Okay. Is usually, someone between 15 and 25 who is male, right? Men between 15 and 25 commit the most crimes, right? After which point, crime starts to decline. And by the time you hit your 40s, right, most men even who had been committing crimes are not committing as many crimes, either because they're in jail or because they've kind of given it up. I think probably the best theory as to why you have this spike is You have that kind of pronounced demographic bulge that's caused by the baby boomers. So you just have a lot of young men in this kind of age range, right? So it takes a long time to kind of work through that. And once you hit the kind of late 80s, early 90s, you start to have, essentially fewer and fewer young men as a portion of the population, so it declines. Also, sorry, I'm trying to think of there's like 4 reasons that people usually put forward. One of them is lead paint. That lead paint was rotting and lead in gasoline was rotting everyone's brains, and they banned it in the 1980s, and then everybody got smarter again, sort of, right? What's the other one? Oh, what happens too is you have a real increase in police forces and the criminal justice system that's generally seen as a sort of reaction to this crime wave. And as it gets bigger and more sophisticated, it tamps down the crime. So crime rises until the state is able to sort of put a cap on it. But mostly is that I think that you have a lot of men, kind of 15 to 25. And then, it's not like they stop committing crimes at 25. It tails off as they get older. So you have this huge number of young people that are in that kind of age range to commit crime. So that I think is the reason. I need to erase all of this. So see if you can stump me and find random things I don't know. This is one of the advantages to having taught both introductory sociology and intro to crim, is that you just have this really weirdly broad palette of random facts at your mental fingertips, because you've had to learn them to teach these really broad courses. Okay. Also, I'm a nerd, so there we go. What did I leave? Okay, here we go. Most of the millennials, right, grew up with the internet as a pretty pervasive part of their lives, right? So 1995, right, your oldest millennials, that's the year the internet becomes kind of commercially available. Your oldest millennials are 15, but most of your millennials, right, are much younger than that. So most millennials remember growing up in a world where the internet was at least available. You probably had it, if you didn't have it at home, you probably had it at school, because schools jumped on this bandwagon really quickly, or at the public library, right? But it was around, maybe at internet cafes, all of that kind of stuff. So millennials are probably the first generation that grows up, with digital technologies available, which is why they're sometimes referred to as digital natives, versus the boomers and Gen X were often referred to as digital immigrants, right? People who didn't grow up in the digital world and have sort of come to it later on. Okay, millennials are also the first ones to really experience social media, right? Facebook being the big one, which becomes kind of widely available in 2005, and sort of is a big deal was happening through Facebook. It was a very, very weird cultural moment, but it was just like everybody, and we didn't have smartphones then, but everybody was just hopping on Facebook and getting Facebook accounts, right? There had been social media prior to this, like MySpace, but Facebook is really when it catches fire. Now, again, your kind of oldest millennials are going to be 25 when Facebook really hits, but there's a lot of them that are younger than that in their kind of late teen and early emerging adult years. Okay, what am I doing? 14-ish minutes. I have so much more to say about the millennials, which we'll have to go into next week, which is okay. So, they're super highly educated as compared to older generations. About 1 in 3 millennials have a 4-year college or university degree, the highest proportion of any generation up to that point. And actually, by 2019, they were earning more on average than the 3 previous generations were at the same point in their life. So economically, the millennials did pretty well. And because they have fewer children, they tended to have more disposable income, right? Fertility drops pretty considerably for the millennials. They have way fewer children, which means, if you have two working adults making more money, they were tending to do pretty well and very focused on lifestyle. Now, 34% less wealth than previous generations at the same age in 2016 and 11% less by 2019. And this is mostly due to housing. Problems with housing and housing affordability start to dog the millennials, really starting in the really starting in the 2000s, right? As housing prices in Canada, the US, and most parts of Western Europe really start to spike. Canada's especially vulnerable to this because we have a deeply real estateized economy. Now, because they went to school for longer than the boomers or Gen X, they started buying and saving, saving and buying homes later, right? So they don't do this until on average, like kind of 22 by the time they get out of school, as opposed to, both boomers and Gen X, both of whom probably were closer to 18 to 20 when they were done a lot of their formal education. So the millennials start saving later and buying homes later. There's also a different kind of vision of how you move through life. We'll talk about when we get to families. But today, millennials have largely caught up in terms of wealth compared to the two previous generations at the same point in their lives. So don't listen to millennials. I will never not laugh when I see the Kardashians. I don't know why. Why did I put this graphic here? Oh, I will tell you. Okay, so the millennials, right? Even though they've largely caught up economically, right, by the time they're kind of hitting their 30s, millennials are not actually poor, despite millennials often complaining that they are poor. They do struggle because of things like a high cost of living and higher college debt. However, what Twenge suggests, and I think this is essentially correct, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about families, particularly about the way millennials tend to think about marriage. Millennials have sky-high expectations about what life is going to look like at very early ages. And this, again, I'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about work, has often been read by other generations, especially the boomers, as millennials being entitled. I don't know what I just tried to write here. Entitled, there we go. Entitled, right? That they're entitled. They feel like they should have everything now. Now, what Twenge suggests is that social media might play a role in this as well. That you have things like, especially visual-based ones, but things like Facebook and Instagram that display like the best parts of everybody's life all the time, right? Where people post like the most exciting thing, the tropical vacation they just took, rather than the sloggy thing or the fact that, hey, I'm having trouble making my bills this month or whatever it happens to be. So some of this kind of sense that, millennials are hard put upon or are poor or aren't doing well in the economy might be because, they see sort of, figures of glamour like the Kardashians all the time on social media showing how amazing their lives are, or, influencers on TikTok or some other social media platform, showing themselves traveling all around the world, and they get kind of jealous, right? Because they're not able to do that. They don't see all the stuff behind it. All right. Maybe I'll do a couple more and then about midterms. That's a random question at a random time, but I will answer your random question. 300 words for the entire question is usually pretty adequate. I'll show you what it looks like next week, probably on Wednesday, because the first midterm is the Wednesday after that, right? After the May long weekend. So, but we'll talk about that more as we go. Okay. Slow life, right? So again, slow life strategy. We talked about that just at the beginning of this lecture. Again, The millennials have had a pretty slow life. And again, I would say, a really long adolescence. Not the terrible Netflix series. Or at least a really long emerging adulthood. I only say that series is bad because I watched it and it completely misrepresents knife crime in Britain and how knife crime actually happens, right? And who commits knife crime. It's not like incels. They're too busy, living in their mom's basement to go out and stab someone. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's not a good series. Don't watch it. It gives you the wrong impression about things. So, the average age of marriage for millennials is really, really high, right? Especially compared to, right, like the silence, right? We talked about the silence a few minutes ago, right? You had 17, 18, and 19-year-old women making up half of the women getting married. That is definitely not the case for millennials. The average age of women and men at first marriage is 28 for women, 30 for men. And certainly this is going to continue trending up into the 30s. An increasing number of women, amongst the millennial cohort had never been married by their late 30s, right? So it's about a quarter of millennial women had never been married by their late 30s, my sister included, which will never cease to disappoint my parents, of which I could not be happier. It was 1 in 18 for the boomers. I got to be careful because weirdly, like, my sister is really good friends with this family that has kids who now, like, one of their friends was in one of my classes. So I got to watch what I say increasingly for a couple of years until those people filter through the system. All right. About 30% of men in their 30s were never married compared to 15.2% for the boomers. So marriage patterns have broadly changed for the millennials. Yeah, and some experts think that about 1 in 5 or 20% of women in the millennial cohort will never get married, right? So this is a big change, right? A big transformation in the way we organize social life. And the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds living with a partner had also declined. So all this to say, it's not just cohabitation. Sometimes we think it's like, oh, yeah, people aren't getting married because they're just living together. But actually, the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds living with a romantic partner has also been declining. So it's just people living alone forever. Millennials having the fewer children than any generation in history. The average age of a mother at the birth of her first child. The average age of a mother at birth of her first child for mothers born in the 1990s, right? So our millennials was 27, right? Meaning they're having those who are having children are having them much later and leaving much less time to have children. And again, this is trending upward into the 30s as well. So this is probably slow life and individualism. Okay, so I'm going to tell you one more thing, and then maybe I will let you go for the day, because we only have like 4 minutes, and I don't want to start a new slide. You can see, right, these charts, right, never married, growing, married, declining. Percentage of 25 to 39-year-olds who are married by generation, right, it goes down, millennials being the lowest, and, people living with their, with a romantic partner, it's going down, alone or with roommates, kind of flat, and people living with their parents equal. Okay, I'm going to tell you something random because I did some math because I was curious. Because one of the big questions that's been floating around, and especially Elon Musk has been like doing Elon Musky things about fertility. And, like saying like, well, people need to have more babies and all of this stuff. So I did some math and I attempted to calculate, and it's a fairly crude model because I used kind of a lot of assumptions. But in order to get Canada back to a positive total fertility rate, the average Gen Z woman sorry, 55% of Gen Z women would have to have 3 children or more. So that is definitely not going to happen. So if anyone talks to you like we need to get fertility rates up, I think your answer should be you first. It's likely not going to happen, right? Because it's just, I don't think in this cultural setting or in this economic setting, it's conceivable. But I ran a bunch of numbers through a bunch of formulas, and I was like, I wonder how many, like what percentage of Gen Z women would have to have, 3 children or more in order to get us up to replacement fertility. And it's about half, because you're a small demographic cohort. So I will leave it at that random bit of trivia, which I just find amusing for no particular reason. Maybe because I get to use the words Elon Musk and screw up the algorithm on YouTube again. Okay, so have a great weekend, which always feels weird to say on a Wednesday. We'll see you back on Monday. We're going to keep going with this. Probably have one more topic in us after this, which will be education. And then we'll prep for the midterm, which is the day you come back from the Victoria Day long weekend. So still a long time away. Millennials rock.